Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to jump into a video called Why Sweden is Immune to Wars. It's by a channel called OBF, which I have never reacted to any of their videos before, so I don't really know what to expect going into it. I don't totally agree with the title of it, but I don't know really what direction they're going, so we'll kind of parse it as we get through it. Before we jump into it, I was going to reference, I did a couple of economic videos a while back. I was asking basically a lot of questions about the general economy in Sweden, and in Europe in general, everybody in Europe, what the economy is like, housing market, inflation, all of that. It just came out that Open Door, which is a real estate company here that basically they're called house flippers, but really what they did more so was like flip contracts. They would go in, buy a house, maybe in some cases make upgrades to it, but in some cases they're really just buying it and flipping it for whatever the housing market has gone up in that time period. And because the housing market during COVID was just shooting straight up, that was a viable business model. It just came out that they lost $400 million in Q4 of last year. So in the last quarter of last year, they lost $400 million. And, that is kind of there's a lot of data that's like mixed and skewed and hard to see through right now, but there keeps being a bunch of red flags like that when you see them, you're like, okay, well, regardless of whatever I'm hearing about how great everything is and how great the housing market is and all that, they deal with housing and just lost $400 million in one quarter. So, any updates to the economic situation in Sweden or in other countries in Europe? I'm extremely curious. I read and watch stuff a lot off the channel. That is, obviously I do a lot of history stuff too, but I also do a lot of economic stuff. Anybody that watches the channel probably knows that. So keep me updated. Let me know how everything's going. I'm very curious to know what it looks like on the ground everywhere. So, but anyway, with all that being said, my little, rant out of the way, let's jump into it. Why Sweden is immune to wars.
Look at these maps of wars over the last 200 years in Europe, and you'll see a few countries that clearly didn't participate. And you're probably thinking of Switzerland, but Sweden has also been neutral in every conflict since 1814. It might sound odd today, but Sweden was once a powerful empire, and no, I'm not talking about the Vikings. In the 1600s, they once controlled Finland, Estonia, and parts of what is now Germany, Poland, Norway, and Russia. But in 1809, they lost Finland after suffering a massive defeat by Russia. So they decided they were better off not getting involved anymore.
We've obviously had a lot of conversations about this stuff. The Great Northern War, the 30 Years' War. We've done a lot of stuff over the Swedish Empire. We've talked about, Charles the 12th and sort of not necessarily just controversial in the way sort of his image is used a bit today, but controversial in the way that he's a good leader, certainly a good military leader, who, because of his sort of hard-headedness and just such headstrong mindset of never losing, sort of put Sweden in a really bad spot. Obviously things changed drastically once he dies, unfortunately, but, well, maybe not unfortunately that it changed, but unfortunately that he died in the way that he did. But yeah, the Swedish Empire was, played a big role on the European stage for a while.
They skipped out on the destruction of World War I and somehow avoided getting entangled in World War II, well, Kind of. See, they continued to trade with Germany and had to let Nazi troops pass over their land to access Finland. At the same time, they also traded with the Allies and protected some refugees escaping the Nazis.
Okay, don't kill me for pausing so much. I'm sorry. I've talked about this before, but I sort of split hairs a little bit here. Sweden to me is more of a non-belligerent during World War II, more so than like a true neutral. And, you know, it can be argued, I guess, either way. But when I look at a country like Belgium in World War One, who, you know, immediately, if German troops step foot on Belgian soil, Belgium will go to war to protect its neutrality. Like, you know, Belgium put itself in a bad situation in World War One to protect that neutrality. And it's hard for me to call what Sweden did in World War Two the same as what Belgium did in World War One. Now, before everybody freaks out, I'm not taking a shot at Sweden. I've said this before. I feel like maybe in a way that people don't like, sort of like in a realpolitik sort of way, I feel like they played World War II well if the goal was to protect Sweden. Like if the goal is some sort of like broader global ethical thing, then I guess it can be argued against, you know, how they operated. Um, but if it's about protecting Sweden, which I mean, the leaders of a country, that's really their job, is to, you know, look after the citizens who elected them. I feel like they sort of walked an impossible tightrope and somehow didn't get taken by Germany or the Soviet Union, which if you looked at the start of World War II when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was first signed, you would immediately think that the Baltics are going down. Like somebody is going to take the Baltics. But again, they played the situation well.
Especially the Danish and Norwegian Jews toward the end of the war. To show how serious they are about neutrality, official foreign policy documents include the words, quote, non-alignment in peace aiming at neutrality in war, quote end. Since World War II, Sweden's official neutrality let it take on the role of conflict mediator over the years. In the late 1960s, for example, it secretly tried negotiating peace in Vietnam by sending messages between the Americans and Vietnamese communists. And in 1975, Sweden was the first Western country to open an embassy in North Korea, which still operates in Pyongyang today.
Yeah, I actually didn't know about this until relatively recently that they have like a standing embassy in North Korea.
The neutrality policy and reputation as a mediator led to many Swedes taking top positions in the UN over the years, like the second UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. This long history of neutrality continued through the Cold War up to just recently. In a remarkable shift, Sweden has just announced it's finally joining NATO, bringing 200 years of neutrality to an end. You've probably
What does everybody think about this? Good, bad, indifferent, for it, against it? I know this can kind of be a hot button issue, but I'm curious what everybody thinks.
heard of NATO before, but just to make sure we're all on the same page here, NATO is short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a US-led military and political alliance of countries in Europe and North America. It was created in 1949 to stop the spread of communism in Europe and defend Western Europe against an invasion by the Soviet Union. What's important is that each member has signed the NATO Treaty, which states in Article 5 that, quote, an armed attack against one shall be considered an attack against them all, quote end. That means if a big country like Russia attacks a small country like Denmark, Denmark can count on the military support and resources of every other NATO country, including the US. In the late 40s, Sweden tried to create a new
Yeah, they basically like invoke Article 5. So the country that gets attacked sort of like basically like think of it like the Batman symbol, right? A small country gets attacked, they turn on the NATO symbol, and then all of the NATO countries are supposed to show up. It's a way to, initially at least, it was a way to protect areas and basically offer this position of like an overwhelming response. So like you can't just pick off smaller countries because there will be an overwhelming response from NATO for it.
Neutral alternative to NATO called the Scandinavian Defence Union, but the US wanted Norway and Denmark to join NATO so they could put military bases on their land and sell them US weapons, so Sweden had to go alone. While NATO seemed to lose relevance after the Cold War ended, the organization has recently become incredibly relevant as Russia invaded parts of Ukraine and continues to threaten other countries. Which brings us back to why Sweden is now taking this drastic step. Let's consider what would happen if Sweden were attacked by another country if they weren't part of NATO. So let's use the example of Russia. If we look at total military personnel, Russia has Sweden outnumbered by an insane margin. Swedish aircraft and tanks are way outnumbered too, although their naval power is pretty decent since they have more patrol vessels. That's critical since the two countries don't share a land border but are both sitting on the Baltic Sea. According to the Swedish military, the country aims to hold off an invasion for around 3 months. After that, if no one comes to help, they might have to trade their Volvos in for Ladas and start speaking Russian. And while neutrality may seem to work for Sweden, what neutral countries probably don't want you to know is that the whole idea of being a neutral country is kind of impossible to pull off. See, to fend off potential invaders, you need enough strength to credibly defend yourself. That's why Sweden makes those awesome Saab fighter jets, and why Sweden has a big arms industry for its size. I mean, it's the world's 14th largest arms exporter despite having a population of just 10 million. To put that into perspective, that's slightly more than the city of Seoul, South Korea, but in an entire country. It's inevitable that to get the best weapons and technology, one small country probably can't provide everything it needs. This is
Yeah, so a couple of things. Obviously, we've talked about this before. The Swedish arms or defense industry is sort of unique in how it operates and the level it operates at on the world stage. So they're sort of really interesting to look at in a sort of global or geopolitical sort of way. The other thing is, yeah, if so, with the idea that if Sweden gets attacked, my guess is the thought process before the Ukraine war was probably something more like the Winter War, which, you know, is sort of like just you can't hold out forever, but it's make them pay for every inch with blood, like that sort of thing. And obviously Sweden has the total defense thing and you know, continuous guerrilla warfare and all sorts of stuff like that. But before the Ukraine invasion, it was more, or at least from my view, more of like a winter war situation where that's sort of like the best you could hope for if it carried on for a long time. After the Ukraine situation, I'm not sure that's the case because, I mean, going into the Ukraine one, nobody really expected Ukraine to hold out for very long, but you have the supplies, the weaponry, and to be honest, the money and manufacturing of a huge chunk of the world behind the war effort. And when that happens, it just totally changes the equation. So I'm a little more sort of in the gray on how exactly that would play out now that I've seen what's obviously happened in the last year.
what historians Mikael Nilsson and Marco Wyss called the armed neutrality paradox. To put it simply, you need the best weapons so no one can force you to pick sides, but you still have to pick sides to get these best weapons. So during the Cold War, Sweden's military bought much of their equipment from the US, which meant they agreed to US demands. In many ways, Sweden was more of an informal NATO ally than an outright neutral country. In 1957, US helicopters landed on Swedish territory without permission. Sweden officially protested this violation of their sovereignty, but privately assured the Americans they were obliged to protest to prevent the Soviets from doing the same. This landing seemed like an isolated incident, but in reality, NATO had a secret flight path that passed over the southwest of Sweden all throughout the 50s and 60s, and the Swedish government was well aware of it. Still, the Americans had to avoid violating Sweden's airspace on the east coast, where Soviet radar could easily detect them. It might sound like the US could just push Sweden around whenever it wanted. The Americans asked them to join a secret embargo to stop selling military equipment to communist countries, giving them access to the very best American weapons in exchange. Still, the Americans couldn't just force Sweden to do what they wanted. Sweden consented to their actions, carefully balancing the need to appear neutral while ultimately acting in their best interest. The country had bargaining power because they were an important buffer state between NATO and communist countries.
And it's different if Sweden, like, everybody knows the deal. I've talked about this before with, with why Sweden is making these top of the line weapons and all that. Everybody is looking in the same direction where something might pop off, or where somebody, everybody's looking to the same place. And so because of that, it's a lot easier to come to a mutual understanding about all of this, because everybody's eyes are fixed on the same region of the world, and everybody's worry is sort of centered around the same place, if that makes any sense.
Sweden maintained some level of neutrality for a long time, only officially inching closer to NATO in the past decade. But why remain neutral if it's more for appearances than reality? Well, maintaining the status quo helped Sweden avoid provoking the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet threat disappeared, the question was less whether Sweden should maintain its neutrality than why it needed to have such a big
What was that? That stadium thing right there.
military at all anymore. After the Cold War ended, joining NATO wasn't even on their radar. Sweden actually shrank its military and focused on UN peacekeeping missions abroad, continuing to build on their peaceful image to promote human rights and democracy. When the country joined the EU in 1995, it technically joined a military alliance, but the EU didn't offer much protection compared to NATO. That's because the EU's cooperative defense missions are only outside Europe, and EU military support would require all EU members to agree before sending any help. By 2010, Sweden abolished the draft, and young Swedes no longer had to serve time in the military. The end of the Cold War meant other changes for Europe, like the end of the communist regimes in the East. Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary were once members of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet answer to NATO. But in 1999, they happily joined NATO. The Baltic countries, sitting right on Russia's doorstep, joined in 2004. NATO actually tried to collaborate with Russia on security during the 2000s, but we probably didn't realize how much NATO's expansion alarmed Vladimir Putin until the invasion of Crimea in 2014. The invasion showed that Europe wasn't as stable as we had thought, suddenly changing the equation for both Sweden and NATO as a whole.
Yeah, this may be a relatively unpopular opinion, but I think the US missed a big opportunity to pull Russia into the Western fold right when the Soviet Union collapsed. I think there was a span of years there after the collapse of the Soviet Union where there was a giant opportunity for the US and generally for the rest of the West. But I feel like the US really could have gone a long way to make this happen, to pull Russia into that fold. And everything had been about, not even just with the Western countries, with Russia itself, everything had been about keeping it isolated for so long that I feel like nothing, everybody just kind of stood around and waited for somebody else to do or say something about it. And then it eventually jumped to the path that it's on today. But I feel like there was an opportunity there when the Soviet Union first fell that totally could have changed what the world looks like today. I think it was a huge missed opportunity.
Changed its defense strategy away from peacekeeping, increasing collaboration with NATO, and reinstating the draft in 2018, opening it up to include women. If you look at every year since 2014, Sweden has inched closer to NATO each year, even before public opinion was in favor of joining. In a 2017 report, Sweden's military stated, quote, "Sweden will not remain passive if another EU member state or Nordic country suffers a disaster or an attack. We expect these countries to take similar action if Sweden is affected." Quote end. Though it stated Sweden would need to defend itself for a while before other countries came to its aid. The country also has done a lot to prepare for NATO membership, adopting English.
Yeah, and it may not be that easy. Like, I know that thought process is there. It obviously is. There's the Nordic countries sort of like share a lineage with each other. But think about the Winter War. Like, Sweden helps, and there are other countries in the region that help, but it's not as easy as just like throwing the entire weight of your country behind them. When the conflict actually starts, there may be things that you have to take into account that you don't really know yet. That's not really to say one way or the other, it's just kind of a note on that.
As its operational language back in the 90s, becoming a NATO host nation in 2016 and adopting NATO interoperability standards. What that means is standardizing their weapons, training, and procedures so different countries can quickly work together in a crisis. As a host nation, Sweden can more easily help or ask for help from NATO and can host exercises on its soil. After taking so many steps, Sweden was ready to join NATO by the time Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Once public opinion shifted in favor of joining, the wheels were already moving, and it was only a short leap to become the 31st NATO member alongside Finland.
I know that y'all probably look at this stuff and don't even think twice about it, but I can't tell you how many times I've watched some of these videos and been like, wow, that building looks incredible, or like, but I just don't say anything. But every time they're showing pictures of buildings and cities and stuff, I'm just glued to it. I would love to see it in person.
So while Vladimir Putin might decry yet another country joining NATO, NATO membership is less of a big deal than it's made out to be because Sweden was already so close. And while it was a shock to see 2 centuries of neutrality finally come to an end, there is a very good reason why Sweden and Finland want to join so quickly. In theory, any European country can join NATO. In reality, they have to be invited first and meet certain conditions, like being democracies with market economies and reforming their military to be compatible with NATO. Most importantly though,
yeah, I could go on an hour-long tangent about the history and role and general dickheadedness of Turkey, but I'll leave it for another video.
They can't have any ongoing conflicts, which is a fact that has been exploited by Vladimir Putin before in Georgia in 2008 and now in Ukraine. That means if Sweden gets invaded before joining, it wouldn't be eligible to join NATO and benefit from its collective defense. This is also why Putin publicly warned Sweden against joining, since once they're in NATO, they're a lot harder to invade.
Yeah, with how things are going in I feel like he's probably got his hands full right now.
Well, there are safety in numbers, especially when you join an organization that calls Russia its #1 threat. Now that the two countries are set to join NATO, there's not much Putin can do about it. But that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Okay, so that was why Sweden is immune to wars. I thought that was a pretty good video. I'm curious what everybody thinks about it. Like I said, I don't feel like there's any real. I don't think that the danger that may have been there pre-Ukraine, I don't think is there for the joining of NATO now. Sort of like with the World War II thing when, you know, Sweden is sort of placating Germany in order to stay out of the war. Eventually, like once Operation Barbarossa starts and Germany has all of its troops in the Soviet Union, from that point on in the war, there's really nothing they can do. You know, if you looked at raw numbers, like, yeah, okay, you would think like, okay, well, they would still steamroll Sweden. That it just wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened because they had all they could handle and more, you know, outside of what was going on around the Baltic. So I feel like they're in a good situation other than, again, Turkey, which I won't get into it. God, I'm not going to get into it, but Turkey is obviously sort of a thorn in the side. And go back and look at those three things that you have to be in NATO. Go look at those and line them up with Turkey. It's just it's an interesting concept to say the least. But all right, that was why Sweden is immune to wars. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.